Today, please help me to welcome Nancy Steinhardt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. China's early mosques, and that was kind of intrepid field work. And the thesis was that a Chinese mosque and a Chinese temple can be indistinguishable. And I'm going to give you evidence of that, and I'm going to have to get you up to speed on that topic before I move to today's topic. But what I realized, what should have been the last chapter of that book, is that a Muslim tomb in China doesn't follow the rules that a mosque follows. And so that's what we're really going to talk about today. We're going to look at tombs of Muslims, and some of them fairly famous Muslims in China. But of course, we have to begin here, because there are rules, in some ways strict rules, for how a Muslim should be buried. And one of the most profound messages that one gets from a Muslim tomb anywhere in the world, and now I'm talking about global Islam, is that even if we're dealing with the tomb of royalty in Saudi Arabia, which is what you're looking at on the left, in death everyone is equal. And that means that the King Faisal 30 years ago or 40 years ago or whenever he died, and Abdullah in 2015 is buried the way you see it on the lower left. This, of course, is in great contrast to how royalty is buried in China. There's a long history of this too, beginning with the kings of Chiang on the top left and coming through Tang and then Sung and ending up with China's last dynasty, Chiang. So that's taking me almost to modern times, almost to the year 1900. On the bottom left, I'm looking at palatial architecture in its most dramatic setting. There also is a history of how royalty is buried in the ancient Mideast, tombs that perhaps royalty would have seen. So the Royal Cemetery of Ur on the left, I'm circa 1900 BCE, and I'm in Iraq, and of course the Great Pyramids that date even earlier. So now we are looking at 4 Chinese tombs, 4 tombs in China. And as I said, this breaks down, and one of the things that art historians pride themselves in is standing in front of their painting, or in my case, their monument, and knowing what they're looking at because of these decades of studying visual culture. And so there isn't much in any of these that would tell you both that it's a Muslim and that it's in China. So these 4 tombs is where we end up at the beginning. This is in contrast to what you're seeing on the right. Every one of these is a mosque. And these are the kind of pictures that drew me to China to do research on approximately 70 mosques, pre-modern mosques, that still survive. And so what you saw here builds right out of here. So the fact is, one of the reasons I've always felt that Chinese architecture hasn't drawn lots of people into the discourse is because there's always something in us that wants to say, but all Chinese buildings look like all other Chinese buildings, and we're too embarrassed to say it, and so we must be missing something. Yes, once you say it, yes, a lot of Chinese buildings do look like a lot of other Chinese buildings, whether it's the Forbidden City, which is always our archetypical building, or a building from the Ming tombs, or a pagoda. You're looking at elevation on a platform, you're looking at a timber frame, you're looking at bracket sets that interface pieces of wood for support, and you're looking at ceramic tile roofs. And this is not really superficial. We can look at 1200 BCE, very well constructed, well documented excavation site in Shanxi, and we can look at, I've chosen a model here of the Forbidden City, and we have 3 main structures on a line enclosed by a covered arcade, and we even have back here this capital I-shaped formation which designates Imperial Chinese construction. We can do the same thing here. This is not just a superficial statement of someone who's not looking closely. This is Humudu outside of Shanghai, 5000 BCE. I'm looking at this notch. I'm looking at a building manual from circa 1100 that shows me how to make the notch, and I'm looking at reconstruction in the Forbidden City today in the old style. So the fact is, coming into this Chinese architectural sphere, there are certain standards that always are followed and are almost never broken. Question is why? Well, I'll get to why in just a second. Chinese architecture builds along axial lines, something we know. Chinese architecture is low. This is a pagoda, and we think China, but if you really look at this, I've chosen an exaggerated version, but I am looking at a monastery, and the pagoda sticks out like a sore thumb. The fact is, the pagoda always looks unnatural. Buddhism was the first foreign faith the Chinese had to absorb into their architectural tradition, but it doesn't fit. That's why sometimes there are two pagodas, sometimes the pagoda's in its own precinct, sometimes there's one. Chinese architecture builds along courtyards. Chinese architecture is never a building seen in isolation. We use the word gong for palace, but it's always a complex. There's always going to be a most important building, but the concept is never just one building. Gates are very important. They mark the division between less important and more important, or less sacred and more sacred space. Chinese architecture is human-sized. This doesn't show this as well, but it sort of does. The people come to almost half the height of the pillars, and this is the most important building in China where only the emperor can enter, or the emperor and people invited by him, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. So these are not tall or large buildings, and they're made of wood, and the wood, of course, is perishable, and there is in the wood a module. And what that means, so now we're getting to why the system's so ingenious and probably doesn't change. That means that knowing the module, there is always interchangeability of parts. That means that when it's time for the palace to change, it becomes the hall of an eminent Buddhist deity with a high-ranking or important or wealthy patron, and vice versa. But the module here and the module here are the same. And what that also means is that when I look at these buildings, I know they're both from the 9th century. Probably people who don't know how this works say, oh, well, this is early and this is late. Not true. This is low rank, this is high rank. And so it is a system with a visual language that's always telling you something about it. Chinese architecture is heavily polychromed, and it is possible for there to be privacy, but that's only within a courtyard or within a garden. So what this tradition really means is, which one is the mosque? Okay? Take a look at my 8 images. Confucian, Buddhist, Taoist, garden, residential. Here's my mosque. Palatial, funerary, and palatial. And I've given you a clue. He's dressed as a Muslim who's about to pray. But there is nothing here that tells you on the outside visually that you're looking at a mosque. So what's this all about? Well, one of the appeals of this system is incredible adaptability. And that means for some of the more negative concepts that are floating around the world in the 18th century, or a little bit earlier, William Chambers can be asked to design something Chinese to show that Imperial England, with its colonial aspirations, can just plop a pavilion right inside of her, or Tivoli Gardens much later in Denmark for pleasure. But all one needs are those roof tiles and something of a timber frame. Kew Gardens is actually made of brick. What that also means is that someone who's a Sogdian, someone who comes from the region that's today Tajikistan or Uzbekistan and is foreign, can give himself a Chinese wife, and she may or may not be Chinese, but he puts himself into a clearly Chinese building. He even gives us 2 sets of roof rafters, one circular and one 4-sided, and one of the most beautiful buildings of Buddhist Japan from circa 700, the Tamamushi Shrine, also tells us that the origins of this tradition is China. And what that means is not only adaptability, but clear visuality. It means that someone, it's a clip from a movie about the Berchem, but somebody coming on horseback at any time who sees a building's golden roofs or ceramic tile roofs rising above a low wall says, this is China, this is Imperial, I want that, I'm going to become that. And that, in fact, is what happens. So that when Islam came to China, you can read a whole book that explains to you how buildings like this become mosques, and the builders are Chinese builders, and the worshipers are Chinese-speaking Muslims, and these are also mosques. So if you know the city of Suzhou, then you wouldn't be surprised that this is actually in Zhejiang, but it looks like Suzhou, Jiangsu architecture. The architecture even reflects the local environment, but doesn't tell you that you're in a mosque, and neither does the interior. If somebody wants to give a sermon, it's simple enough to put a pulpit inside. And here, oh yeah, I know I'm in a mosque because I have Arabic or Persian script, but that's what's behind this. And then we come to the tombs. So, what are Muslims told? There's no one line in the Quran that says this is how a Muslim is supposed to be buried. But the body of literature that's called Hadith, that reports and interprets the Quran, says that ostentatious burial is repugnant. Now, those who know Chinese literature know that around the year 200, there was also a drive against what's called lavish burial or thick burial. The Chinese didn't particularly take it seriously, but Muslims did take it seriously. The corpse is supposed to be level with the ground to symbolize equality in death, but Muhammad's grave is supposed to have been underneath his house. Therefore, sometimes a marker will be put above the corpse. So you're looking at examples here. This, by the way, is from China. But you're looking at examples here, and the head is supposed to face Mecca and be turned to the north, or face the north and be turned to Mecca. In Chinese, the head faces north and is supposed to be turned westward. So how do tombs begin? Well, there are mausolea, and people usually use this word mausolea across the Muslim world. The one in Cuba, Cuba is an Arabic word that means dome. And this is kind of interesting because they are almost always domed. Gumbad is the Persian word, and the Chinese call it gongbei. We're going to see some of these at the end. So one of the earliest is in Samarra. That's a picture from an old book. What you're looking at on the left is how it's been rebuilt today. And architectural historians say, well, the source would have to be either Roman architecture or early Christian architecture. That makes sense. Again, I'm trying to get to where I need to go. I'm talking fast. But we have classical commemorative monuments like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So I'm using the word commemorative. It's from here that Muhammad is supposed to have ascended to the heavens, and we don't have any living creatures. We have a lot of pure ornament. It has a dome. It happens to be octagonal. But there is this body of commemorative architecture that existed before Muslims came to China. So this is now where the study of Muslim tombs in China begins. Muslims were in China in the dynasty called Tang. They certainly were in the city of Chang'an, so I'm in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, but there's no evidence of a tomb. In fact, there are no remains of mosques that can confirm. There's one stele that suggests a mosque, not the Great Mosque in Chiang, existed in the Tang dynasty. The heyday of activity begins in the southeast, in places like Guangzhou, Quanzhou, Hangzhou, Yangzhou, the port cities that were the termination of the so-called Silk Road of the Sea. People came from India, people came from the Arabian Peninsula. They traded. Because of the trade winds, they stayed in these cities, they lived there, they sometimes married there, and they would sometimes die there, not always intentionally, but usually somebody would have to be there 15 months before the trade winds brought him back. So a man named Zhao Ruguo, you have his dates, wrote in Record of Foreigners, Ju Fan Shi, that there was a cemetery for foreigners on a hill on the eastern side of Quanzhou, and Quanzhou happens to be the city where we have this mosque. So there's something that doesn't fit the big pattern. There are two mosques in China, both originally from the Song dynasty, both that survive in 14th century versions, and this one dates around 1310, that declare that they are Muslim monuments. You are looking for sure at an E1, you're looking at some kind of fortification up here. These windows are very unusual, but this is definitely an entryway that a person would not find in a Chinese temple. It is in this city that there was this Muslim cemetery, but here's what's puzzling. A Muslim named Pu Xiaxin was in charge of it. A wealthy merchant named Shi Na Wei. So these are, I'm giving you the Chinese characters. I wouldn't presume to transcribe names. If people do it, I usually trust them. But Shi Na Wei came from Srivijaya, and it says that the cemetery was wall enclosed, was roofed. So that's kind of interesting. So that means it probably wasn't very large, and that all the city's foreign merchants were allowed to live in it. So already Muslims bury with Muslims. And this is a city with Brahmins, that is with Hindus, and with Manichaeans, and with Christians. So if you go there today, this is what you see. Things are rebuilt, things are fixed up, they're moved, but you see a standard Muslim cenotaph. You've got a couple of them under a roof, and so the evidence suggests that this is standard Muslim burial in Quanzhou. Quanzhou has an enormous museum of foreign trade, and that's where one sees Chinese-style funerary stele like this. This is actually at the cemetery, the one on the right, and all kinds of pieces of stone, some of them Chinese, but some Manichaean and some Christian, and some pure Roman, pure Christian with even Latin or Syriac inscriptions. Hangzhou is another city where Muslims lived in the Song and Yuan dynasties. So this is the tomb of Buhatiyar, and again, somebody is sure what the name is in Persian, then I would go with it, but Buhatiyar is how it comes out in Chinese. Just what one would expect, but this is pure Muslim burial. This fits into the notion that in death someone dies as a Muslim. This is not how we would expect a Chinese person to die. I'm still in Song Yuan dynasties. The mosque in the city of Quanzhou looks like this. So you have a modern facade today, and when you go inside, this is the mihrab and then the Qibla wall. All a person really needs for a mosque is an indicator of Mecca. This is one of the reasons the architecture adapts so easily to Chinese architecture, but I am very interested in this. I was very interested in this when I first saw it, and you're going to see what it is because it's going to come up again. So, Song dynasty, Muslims appear to have buried in fairly pure Muslim burial, underground, flat, with the curved top on a cenotaph, as Muslims were buried in West Asia. One of China's most famous Muslims, maybe one of two, and we'll talk about the second one today also, is this man whose name in Chinese is Saidian Chur, but you do have his Persian name here, which is Al-Said al-Ajal Shams al-Din Umar al-Bukhari. And so this is important to us because we know that he comes from Bukhara. This is where a lot of Muslims came from during the Yuan dynasty. This is the period of Mongolian rule. His father came to China brought by Genghis Khan. This was a group of captives, or so-called captives, that moved across Asia. Saidian Chur trained for membership in the military elite guard at a young age in 1225. So now this is our second Muslim ruler, Ugaday. We begin with Chinggis. Now under Chinggis' son, 1229, he's appointed, I'm giving you the English translations of these titles, Great Resident Commissioner of 3 provinces. He rises to Resident Commissioner in the 1230s, becomes Judge Arbitrator. He's sent to Sichuan. He takes charge of quelling all rebellion, and then under his jurisdiction, both Sichuan and Yunnan, especially centered in Kunming, become fairly peaceful parts of the Mongol Empire, and he dies in 1279 in the city of Kunming. The city mourns his death. There's still an archway to him in that city. He receives the posthumous title Prince of Xianyang. And Xianyang, you may know from the Xianyang of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. This is a place near Xi'an, and some people think his body was moved and he was buried in Xi'an, but probably not. So this is a drawing. On the right is from the original publication. On the left, someone redrew this for me, but this is how it appears in a publication of sketches made by Henri Dolon between 1906 and 1909 of the tomb of Saidianzhi. There was a stele that Dolon saw that said that the tomb had been repaired in 1692 and in 1736. There were more repairs in 1719. You are looking at a cenotaph, and the base of the cenotaph, 4 meters by 2.5 meters. This is the way a Muslim should be buried. So we're still seeing in the Yuan dynasty, where many religions flourish, a Muslim returns to life as a Muslim. And Dolon took this picture, not so much as there right now, but this is part of the cemetery, and there were some stele, and there were some other cenotaphs. Also in the Yuan dynasty, this is the most famous Yuan tomb probably. We know this man was a Muslim, and we know something about him. His name is Tukuluk Timur. Tukuluk Timur comes to power in what's called the Chagatai Khanate. So the Mongol Empire divides into 4 parts. The part that we think of today as Inner Asia is ruled by Chinggis' son Chagatai. That's taking place in the 1220s. I'm now in the year 1346. When a descendant of Chagatai, his name is Tukuluk Timur, comes to power, he converts to Islam in 1347. The population of his Khanate, 160,000 people, convert in 1352. He dies in 1352. He dies in 1363. The Chagatai Khanate ceases to exist, and it will become part of the empire of Tamerlane. So I'm here in western Xinjiang province, near the city that the Mongols called Amalik. Today it's Huacheng, sometimes known as Ili, and you are looking at a mausoleum 15.8 by 6.8 meters at the base and 7.7 meters high. It has tile on the front. It is undecorated on the sides. It has a fairly complicated plan, and it even has, you see 2 stairs here. It even has an arcade around the top. There are 2 tombs in here, one for him, one for his son. People think maybe these arcades were for later family members to come and do viewings or to pay homage. A tomb nearby is believed to belong to his daughter, and there's no question ever that this is the tomb of a Muslim named Tukuluk Timur. Now, I'm, of course, always looking for a Chinese source, so I have to throw this out. There is this very little-known building in Anyang County of Henan that dates to around the year 600 that does have glazed tile on the exterior and is a dome on a square, which is a standard style for a Muslim tomb. I don't think the two have anything to do with each other, but this technology existed in China around the year 600. More likely source is a tomb like this. So Bukhara is a place where many Muslims came from today in Uzbekistan. Buyang Kuli Khan dies just 1 year before Tukuluk Timur. They both have glazed tiles on the front, and they're both unglazed on the side, and they both have a kind of interesting feature of a corner pillar. This one more pronounced, actually. This doesn't, well, it doesn't really have a corner pillar. This one does. This will come up again, and that's in Bukhara. And I'm looking at that because I'm always looking at for imitation timber frame. So the tomb of Buyang Kuli Khan takes as its source a tomb known as the Tomb of the Samanid, also in Bukhara, because nobody knows who's buried there, but the date is 943, and it has this column that I was just looking for. It's what we call usually a dome on a square, even if the base isn't always square. And there's also a 10th century tomb in Team, which is in it's either Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, same part of the world as Bukhara, unglazed. And then here's Tukuluk Timur's tomb. And the tiles have been well studied. And so here's your chronology, or here's your lineage if you are an architectural historian. And so in 2012, I heard about this building, and I got there in 2013, and it ended up being even more extraordinary than anything I was imagining. So I am in Guyuan. I'm going to show you on a map in a minute where I am, near Jiangbei. So Jiangbei means north of Zhangjiakou. It's actually northwest. It's in Hebei, near the border with Inner Mongolia. And I heard about this building, and I stood there, and again, as an architectural historian, it's a Muslim tomb. What else could it be? It's a dome on a square. Well, other people had noticed it and had been as impressed. So the first person who writes about it, as far as I know, is someone named Ginger Zhang, who sometime between 1732 and 1741, commissioned by the Qianlong court, did a geographic study of the part of Inner Mongolia that's just north of, but includes this region that was called at that time Chahar, and included the city or town that's today Guyuan. And then there were additions to the text in 1758 by Huang Karun. So standard Qianlong period literature, this structure almost definitely is mentioned in Zhuan 3, 4, and 15. And so this is what they say about it. That's why I think it's almost definitely mentioned. They call it Shu Zhuanglo. I'm going to show you how this title has come to be used, but they call it Comb and Makeup Tower. They use the Chinese word tower. Well, that doesn't surprise me. Anything in China has to take on a Chinese name, and so there's a dome, so they call it a tower. They say that it was part of the appanage, part of the territory of Empress Dowager Chengtian. Her date's 932 to 1009, so this puts her in the Liao dynasty. This is Liao territory. And she was regent for her son, the Shenzong Emperor, after her husband died in 982. When Shenzong ascended the throne in 986, he gave his mother these lands where she lived, hunted, and spent the rest of her life until her death in 1009. So Comb and Makeup Tower would refer to a woman. Another name that's used is Shiliangge, so cool west pavilion. And so here, ge, which is the Chinese word for pavilion, is used. Again, this dome structure has to be what the Qing text is talking about. They further tell us that what they saw was squarish, brick-faced, more than 2 zhang high, and that would be 13 meters, had a semicircular dome rising from the center of a flat roof. It's kind of a giveaway, right? And then it says that the front entry was in the southeast with a window, and there was a window in the back. And then Guyuan Xianzhi, record of Guyuan County, but this is a 20th century, much more recent record that talks about even commerce and things like that in a county, says that it stands 7.5 kilometers southeast of the center of town and faces southeast. that it's 10 meters square and 13 meters high and cubic in appearance. So this is a building that was standing in the Qing dynasty for sure. So again, so here's your window in the front, here's your window in the back. We go inside, and it is a four-sided building that has cornices, so it's as if you're coming to an octagon, and then the dome interfaces with that. It's now whitewashed. I, of course, am in, and there's nothing inside, but the whitewash could be new. I'm interested in what I'm seeing here, and I'm going back here. Again, I'm always looking from the vantage point of China. So that when I was in Phoenix Mosque in Hangzhou, and I saw this, I said, it's got to be bracket sets. When an Islamicist who knows the field better than I do, but it's important to have good friends or good colleagues when one works outside her comfort zone, Najim al-Din Kubra had this tomb in 1221 in Gurganj, Turkmenistan with this, and so my colleague tells me, well, maybe it's Chinese, maybe it's really a piece of Muqarnas, maybe it's both. Okay, so I don't care really because I think this is a Muslim tomb. Now it gets a little more interesting. Okay, so here's the capital, Dadu. Here's the capital, Chengdu. And here's what's called the central capital, which is very important in this story, and Zhangbei is right here. So Yuan dynasty had two capitals initially, Chengdu, that's Xanadu first, then Kublai comes here in 1267, begins to build this. This city, as you shall see, doesn't rise until the year 1307. So the description is this. So in between 1993 and 1995, a scholar named Wang Bei-chun was doing field work between the city of Dadu, Kublai's capital, and Chengdu or Xanadu, and he came upon this monument. And he was working on a paper about it on his deathbed. Now, we all like to believe we're great scholars, but I don't know if anybody fantasizes about what you might be doing, knowing that you're never going to get out of the hospital. When he was having that moment in 1996, he called in his colleague Lin Mei-Tsun, who's a name that some of you know. He works on Yuan dynasty archaeology. He's been involved in exhibitions at the Met. And he dictated the end of a paper he was writing to Lin Mei-Tsun, who published it posthumously for him. And he said that this monument that we've seen belonged to a man named Ananda. Now, I'm still not sure that this is what is advisable to do on the deathbed, but I know now, I will tell you now why that he decided to do this. So this article that's published in his collected works, some of which are posthumous, says that it is the tomb of Ananda. It was with that I came here, thinking it's the tomb of Ananda. So what does one find? You remember inside the tomb, you see that there are a few things on the walls and a few cases. So I saw some glazed tile. I saw some foundations in the back. And Wang Bei-chun had also noted these foundations in the back, and the tomb had been excavated in 2000. So I think that Wang Bei-chun must have known excavation was on the books and that he wasn't going to live to see it, so he wanted his opinion voiced. Well, it's 3 corpses. It's a male and 2 females. They're underground, and they are not lavish burial. Head is not turned, but the tomb is oriented southeast, meaning the head would be facing the direction of the northwest, and north and west are 2 important directions, but he was buried with burial goods. He was buried with silk around him. So Muslims are not supposed to use silk, but again, colleagues tell me 3 layers of white gauze, but sometimes you can get by with a hidden layer of silk. But this is Yuan dynasty, and he had the grave goods that you see here. So this shouldn't be what a pure Muslim is doing, but he is underground in humble burial. And so, again, this is the interior. Now, who is Ananda? Ananda is, okay, so this will help you. It's not a complicated story if you know the rulers of the Yuan dynasty, but it's a little complicated. These are the key players, okay? Anshi Wangfu, near Xi'an, is the appanage, or the territory, awarded by Kublai Khan to his son Mangala. Mangala was a devout Buddhist. That's why Mangala named his son, who was born as a devout Buddhist, Ananda, the name of a disciple of the Buddha. And this Arabic magic square happens to have been excavated in Anshi Wang. This is Kublai's successor, Timur, so you have his dates. And this is going to be the next successor and the next successor. These two men, Kaishan and Yerbawarda, are brothers. So when Timur dies, Ananda is one of the people in line for succession. And he has some support because he's been a very successful military general. And in fact, the record says that Timur, the deceased Timur's wife, supported him. But Kaishan and his younger brother, Ayurbawarda, were great-grandsons of Kublai, but direct descendants from eldest son. And Ananda is their cousin, but not a direct descendant. And Ananda was executed in 1307, and Kaishan becomes the emperor, and he only lives 4 years, and then his brother Ayurbawarda becomes the emperor. When Kaishan becomes emperor in 1307, he decides that he needs a central capital. He needs some place where he can stop to rest between Dadu and Shangdu. And so this is what the walls look like. That's the excavation site. It's now been well excavated. It's a 3-walled city. It's just what a Yuan period, Mongol period capital should be like. He places his capital not quite a stone's throw, but a couple kilometers by car from this mausoleum, which, if it belonged to Ananda, is land that Ananda owned and where Ananda was buried. Okay, so here I did have a map coming up again. So here's Dadu, here's Shangdu, and here's the central capital, which is constructed only over a 4-year period. When Kaishan dies, construction ends, and a lot of the buildings that were intended to be there actually never get built. So that kind of makes sense. If you read between the lines, there's some suggestion that no one would ever let a Muslim become the emperor of the Yuan dynasty, or the Khan, great Khan of the Yuan dynasty. He didn't have a chance. Okay. That was what I knew in 2013. It was all very interesting and very consistent and exciting in its own right. And I came home and I was talking to a graduate student who said, I should be reading blogs. And I said, well, maybe I should, I don't, but send me anything that I need to know about. So he sent me these clips from China TV, CCTV, with inscriptions on stones that I did not see at the site, but that mention a man whose name is either Kuo or Ke, you can pronounce it either way, Kuli Jisa, who is the prince of Jining, can go by the name Xiang Korguz, who received the posthumous title Zhong Xiang, and he was a Mongol, but he was not a Muslim. And suddenly there comes a body of literature out of nowhere that says this cannot belong to a Muslim. There were no Muslims in this part of China in the Yuan dynasty, okay? So I've got the one blog site. In fact, somebody named Li Tong, I've never met him, he works in Europe, published a conference volume on Syriac Christianity during the Yuan dynasty. And he writes an article in which he says he's never been to the site, but an excavator told him that there was a crucifix with a lotus pattern on it, but when he asked for a picture, the excavator couldn't find it, and a year later he sent him the picture, and this is published on the cover of his book. I didn't bring the picture. I think this is after the fact, and I'll show you why I think this is after the fact. Anyway, there comes a drive. I'm going to drive out of China to clarify that this cannot possibly belong to a Muslim. Now, I was standing right here on June 25th of 2013, and I saw these same buildings that Wang Bei-chun had written about. And on July 14th, fewer than 3 weeks later, the same student said, "Hey, look what happened to your site." And I said, "Hey, that's impossible." But this is, I have dates on, the pictures I was sent. So now, in 2013, it's become a Mongol cemetery, okay? Not Muslim, a Mongol cemetery. Now, I haven't said yet, because it's obvious, Mongol royalty do not bury with any kind of marker. Any Mongol royalty is supposed to return to what's today Outer Mongolia and be buried in unmarked sites. Okay, I then knew I had to go back. So August 15th, this is what it looks like today. So when I went, it was free. I was the only person there. I hired a driver. There's a gravel road. The tires almost break getting up there. And I'm the only one there taking all my pictures. 2 years later, it has a sign, it has an entrance fee, it has a parking lot. And the first thing I did was ask somebody who looked like he had worked there for a while, is it possible that there were 3 or 4 other structures that looked like this behind it at any time? And he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "we put them up for a festival, but we took them down." And I said, "Okay, well now when you go there," so you go on a bridge with lanterns. I stopped counting after I got to the 10th cell phone store in this 3-block town of Guyuan, because this is a huge tourist site. There's a water park, there's a theme park. Everything is moved out of the mausoleum now in 2015 because they're building a museum for this monument, which is today portrayed as Mongol. Okay, not a word of Muslim and not a word about Chiang Korgus, but is supposed to be laid out according to the Big and Little Dippers because the Mongols had great interest in astronomy. And so this is what you see. You walk through the Big Dipper this and the Little Dipper this. And it's cleaned up, and it's won awards for being a model of green space in China. This is another whole lecture, but this is the climax, but I'm not finished because this gets more interesting, not this, but the rest of the story. But when we talk about the reappropriation of monuments for political purposes, okay, this monument needs to be part of this. So I will try to go back in 2000. Oh, that's this summer. Maybe I won't get there till next summer. But this is unbelievable. And it was just kind of luck that I found these things out. Let me try to finish very quickly. If you have to go to class, go ahead. There is a third monument that fits into this group in what's today China. So this is in Karakoto. This is what it looks like today. These are old Oral Stein pictures. It does have these pillars. The Chinese published this as Western Xixia. Well, the Mongols obliterated the Xixia. I don't really believe this was standing. I think a Muslim, a real honest-to-God Muslim, who was part of the conquest built this, but we don't know much about it. So what does this tell us? Well, the question I'm really asking in all this is, when does a foreign religion like Islam proclaim itself, and what does it have to do or not do in order to become part of the Chinese architectural world? Originally in the Song dynasty, rebuilt in the Yuan dynasty, there are 2 examples. The one we saw, and the city of Quanzhou's mosque that has a towering minaret. There is no desire to conceal the fact that these are Muslim worshippers. The minaret, of course, is within an otherwise Chinese building plan. But this political use of monuments is something that's much more interesting. I'll use the word interesting. You can choose a different adverb if you'd like to choose a different adverb or talk about it. So this is probably China's most famous Muslim. This is Zheng He, the great seafarer who some people think died at sea. And Chinese are really buying into this right now. For many years, up to 1959 when it was renovated, again in the 1980s when it was renovated, and as recently as 2009, this monument on the right stood outside the city of Nanjing, where Zheng He had spent an important part of his life. He was a big patron of the mosque in Nanjing, and this was Zheng He's tomb. Until 2010, when the location was challenged by archaeologists digging near the Zhutang Mountains. So Zhutang is one set of mountains outside Nanjing, and Liao shows another set of mountains. And in a cemetery of Buddhist and Taoist eunuchs, they found an empty tomb. And somebody got the idea that this was the empty tomb because Zheng He died at sea, and this proves that he was Buddhist or Taoist, but not really a Muslim, So now we go on to the Ming Dynasty. I need about 5 more minutes, but again, if you have to leave, I don't want your students waiting for you. Now I'm in the year 1408, and I'm in the city of Nanjing. And if I'm standing right here where you are, and I'm looking at a spirit path of animals and scholars or military officials approaching a mound, I have to be in a Chinese prince's burial, Chinese prince's gravesite, right? Well, this tomb of Borneo, the ruler of Borneo, a territory that's sometimes considered Borneo and sometimes the predecessor of Brunei, so I'm in Java, came to China in 1408, predicated by good relations with the Yongle Emperor. Actually, it had good relations with Hongwu. He plans to make his way up to Beijing and present tribute. He dies. His son takes the tribute. He dies in Nanjing, and he gets this grave. And this is the grave of a Chinese prince. There isn't a single epitaph. There is nothing here that tells me it's a Muslim. And a few years later, the king of Sulu, which is a territory that's somewhere today in the Philippines, dies in Dezhou, which is in Shandong near the border with Hebei along the Grand Canal. Also coming, he's already paid tribute to the Yongle Emperor. He's on his way home. He dies, and he gets this spirit path, and he gets this tomb with this Chinese epitaph. Of course, you'd have to go underground to see if he had humble burial and where his head's facing. But this is the tomb of a Ming prince. I just took one from the city of Guilin. Hongwu's 23 or whatever sons all got territory, all became princes. Craig Clunas has written about this, and were awarded the kinds of tombs that anyone who was deemed the status of prince by the Ming Emperor, Yongle on, got. So the King Sejong, the one who gets credit for coming up with the Korean alphabet, he dies in 1450. He's buried in what's South Korea today, and he also has a tomb of a Ming prince. Now, there's one final topic, and this is, what about the Gongbei? What about the Kuba? Right? So what we've seen is that in the Sung Dynasty and in the Yuan Dynasty, Muslims are coming out. They're burying as Muslims, no problem. Suddenly in the Ming Dynasty, this disappears. So now I'm in the Qing Dynasty, the time from which most of the Muslim architecture in China is known, but I'm in Kashgar. What you're looking at on the right is a famous mosque. On the left is a kuba, which I mentioned at the beginning. This is the Arabic word for dome. And Muslims, certain Muslims don't use the word kuba and don't recognize this. They call this a shrine to a martyr of the faith. And there were many martyrs of the faith. They didn't all have to be died to be martyrs. Sometimes they end up dying in a foreign land, and that makes them a martyr. And there were, in the 17th century, many Muslims who came to China who preached various branches of Islam and die in China. And what you're looking at is standard Kuba architecture. It's often four-sided. It always has a very, very fluid roof that can have 4 or 6 sides. And the majority of them are in the area that Chinese usually call Ganning Qing. So it's where Gansu and Ningxia and Qinghai meet. But what's most interesting is Islam was purged all through the ages in this part of China and again in the Cultural Revolution. Everything I'm showing you here is post-1980. Everything I'm showing you here, and it's not international contribution from global Islam. The Emirates are not building these buildings. These are Chinese decisions, Chinese Muslim decisions for how to build mosques with Kuba. So yeah, you might find the crescent moon, but you find Chinese architecture. You find inside the burial where someone is in the kind of cenotaph that I've shown you, prayer mats next to incense burners with Chinese on the incense burners. I wanted to point out the bracket sets that you're looking at here. So, well, here I'm in a Kuba, and here I am in, here I am at, wait a second, yeah, that's my Kuba. Here I'm in a lamasery, and here I'm in a mosque. But my lamasery from the same region has the same bracket sets as the Kuba and the mosque. In other words, this is intentional decision for how to build. This region that I'm traveling in is completely remote. It's still remote. People can, by choice, build anything they want, and it is Hui Muslim, that it is Sinophile or Muslim speakers. This is how somebody knows that he's near a mosque, because it says inside there's a place to wash your hands, and then you see somebody who's a Muslim outside. But this is as remote as travel gets. And 30 feet from the man you just saw, you see this Gongbei, and look at the 21st century iconography. Where am I? Well, I have a Chinese rice bowl with steam. I have some books, and one of the books actually says Quran. I have scholar studio implements. I have writing brushes. Now I go down the road to a Chinese temple or monastery, and I find this in wood. These are Chinese craftsmen who are building, and this you will never see anywhere. This is extraordinary. Quran incense. So in this part of China, people burn incense in mosques. And so here's an incense burner with what you're seeing. And here are 4 panels where we have a scene from South China. We have a moon gate. We have scholar studio. And we have a contemporary mosque. So finally, the system, out of this system, in the realm of death, emerges something that I am finally willing to call Sino-Islamic architecture. And the mosque is not part of this. But it comes, perhaps the best explanation is that it comes during the Qing dynasty, when the world view is of one empire from Kashgar to Korea, or perhaps even further, and when religions other than pure Buddhism and Taoism, that is, when Lamaism and Islam come into existence and exist as they do. But that wasn't the case in the Ming, and that wasn't the case in the Sung and the Yuan, because a mosque still today looks as you see it here, and a Chinese spirit path tomb, imperial tomb, looks as you see it in 3 of these pictures, but actually the 4th one is Islam. So it's only in this world of death that finally something Sino-Islamic emerges. Thank you.